nudes and portraits of inspiring figures, but the nudes were really inspiring. Yes, nudes. They got front page coverage. They were the things that people talked about in the newspaper reviews. I mean, I've looked for condemnations of them. Maybe all of those papers burned. But at the level of newspaper discourse, of intellectual discourse, they do not seem to have been controversial.
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today with me is Kirsten Scheid, who is an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies, and an affiliated faculty in the Fine Arts and Art History department at the American University of Beirut. Kristen earned her PhD in anthropology from Princeton University and her BA in art history from Columbia University. Welcome to Afikra. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Mikey. Thank you so much for that welcome. And I have to say, I was really honored when I received the invitation from Tamara and then met you.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So a little backstory for the listeners. I got the chance to watch you do a lecture at LAU. And it was about this book. And the book is called Fantasmic Objects. And there's a subtext, which I'll let you read. But what does fantasmic mean? Because it's a word that I did not know. And I feel like you had to you've told many, many people, this is not fantastic objects. This is fantastic objects. So what does fantasmic mean? And why is this the title of this book?
So fantasmic, for me, it comes from phantasm, which is one of the ways of thinking about suwar, an Arabic word that people use to describe what I was looking at and walking around and having people tell me about while I was doing my research in Lebanon from about 97 until around, it hasn't finished, but the book finished in 2020. The research project mostly finished around 2010, 11, 12, whatever. Anyway, the phantasm then is deliberately not picture. It's not even image. It's the Greek word that is related to that. It has to do with coming into appearance. And I use it very deliberately the way anthropologists sometimes do to signal a difference or a gap from people's expectations. So it's not about fantasy in the sense of the not real. The phantasm is the thing that hasn't quite congealed. So it doesn't have like an inferior to reality status. It's something that you can see, and you could bring into material being, but it hasn't become a taken for granted thing yet. And to me, that's a really great way of thinking about what we normally call art or fen, and what we tend with that to think about like an object, an artwork, painting, a sculpture, a materially bounded off, frozen, sitting on your shelf or hanging on your wall. With this term phantasm, I'm able to expand my focus a bit and look not just at the given artwork or the thing that seems to have been left behind by an artist, but to include audiences and the actions that we undertake when we are compelled for a minute to stop and look with, think about, engage, talk about, tell other people about, and reflect maybe on our experiences of these phantasms.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to go back to the 90s. You got here in the 90s with the intention of staying for a few years or the intention of spending a few decades studying art in the region?
Yeah. So I got here in 93. Here being Lebanon, I had lived in Palestine before that for a year. But I was marrying in. That was actually the only way to get a visa to come, as a non-Lebanese person, woman. So I married and I intended to stay forever. and then I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? But so the first, let's say the first decade
I'm
was
applying for an eternity visa.
right. Yeah. And actually, once you're Lebanese, you're always Lebanese. Yeah. Um, I mean, it was a project of life. It was a project of having a family, of becoming part of a place. But I did assume I would always travel and live other places too.
Yeah.
And that I do travel, but I'm living here. And now it really feels like home.
Very cool. Okay. So if you were to explain this to to a high school kid, right? To one of the friends of your children. And they saw this book on the shelf and they said, okay, all right, I think you study art from Lebanon. What's the best teenage description of what this book is about?
Okay. So the subtitle, with more pedantic, Art and Sociality from Lebanon, 20 to 50.
Yeah, 1920 to 1950. Yep.
Yeah. So it stands with books that will tell you about the history of art making that co-produced the nation state of Lebanon, which itself gets its independence or declares itself into being, if nation states can do that, in 1943. So it's looking at the pre-period, the advanced time when people were thinking about, well, what is Lebanon? And why would we have this? And why don't we still exist as subjects of an sultanate? And if we're not that, what are we? And it really focuses on not the state actors, not the bureaucrats, not the material and economic infrastructure that we usually turn to explain why things are kind of not working in the Middle East or are wrong or are not going our way. Instead, it looks at the imaginary infrastructure, the ways, the pictures people had in mind, the things that they were struggling to make tangible and involve other people with. And so those for me are art lessons. Like why do people have to learn art? And not just people who are going to be artists, but everyone, starting in like the 1930s. And exhibitions. There had been exhibitions before, but why is it now something that the newspapers are recording who went to and what works they looked at? And it's like front page news. And when I came in 93, the nightly news, which was very conveniently staggered. So you could watch one news at 5:30, one at 6, one at 6:30. They all would have at the end a visit to an art gallery. So I'm struck by that, and that in the U.S. I didn't usually see that on the nightly news. So it's about the coming into being of a place that we called Lebanon through these art acts, and it will tell you the history of certain artists who were active, but also the debates, the social debates, and how people were looking at each other and saying who has a political voice.
It's so interesting. Okay, so I want to ask a bunch of sort of primary questions. In the 1940s, or you started in 1920, right? In the 1920s, when you say art, what are you actually including in this sort of broad term? And where were these artists learning to become artists? What were they doing? Was this a professional endeavor? Were they trying to pay their bills this way? Was it commercial? I mean, talk to me about the sort of the nitty gritty of what these people's lives were like.
So what I was looking for when I started my research and just going newspapers, reading them day by day, mostly microfilm, I was looking for sculptures, paintings, primarily those two things, photographs to an extent. And I knew that I had started learning Arabic a while earlier, and I knew that the words were like fan and rasam and ma'rad. So these were words that were trying to catch my eye. And that is where it stops being simple. But okay, the people that I'm talking about who called themselves musawwirin, which is a word I wasn't expecting to find, so picture makers or phantasm makers, they were making, they were painting in the, or they were sculpting, and they were also doing like home production, like home atmosphere.
Decor.
And but it was considered the place where you raised the future members of society. So it wasn't decor, like just show off, right? So, and that was like from their perspective, and some of their promoters' perspective. And like if you looked in the phone book in 1928, the Jadon phone book, you would, now I maybe got the name wrong, but anyway, you would see Rassam, so painters, and it would be like Rassam Sayarat, painters of cars, Rassam yani Buyut, and then Rassamin, just al-hal, like that, just on its own. And that's where I found the names of the people that I was looking for. And they had ateliers mostly downtown, like in an office building in the Souk area. And like Farroukh's atelier was across from the studio, from the office of Karam Melhem Karam, who was an aspiring journalist at that time. So these were people, Farroukh actually came from what we might think of as lower middle class family. Unsi, Amar Unsi, who I also write about, came from the family of a doctor, which was an entrepreneurial position. Like his father had been trained in Alexandria. You know, people weren't sure what doctors really did then. And Saloua Raouda Choucair, the third artist on whom I focus in the text, was the orphan of a kind of a landed person, a rentier, a person whose family had land that could be rented to other people. So his widow, Salim Raouda's wife, collected, rent, and he also seems to have, so she lived off of that. Let's just say that. So they have different economic positions, and the two men that I talk about, Amr Ansi and Moustafa Farroukh, both had teaching gigs. And I don't think for them that was a bad thing that took them away from their art. They don't seem to have complained about that. It was a way to spread art. So like Amr Ansi taught at the Azhariya College here, an Islamic school.
Let's use Muhammad for a second, right? So as an example,
Moustafa?
Moustafa Farroukh. Excuse me. Let's use him as an example. In that moment, did he think, oh, thank God I'm in Beirut because this is the only place in the region that's doing this? This is a uniquely Beiruti experience? Or was he saying, they're doing it in Damascus, they're doing it in Jerusalem, they're doing it in Alexandria, they're doing it in Tunis, they're doing it in Baghdad, they're doing it in Khartoum, they're doing it everywhere. This is just like what it means to be alive in 1920 and be interested in this type of stuff.
It's great how you're asking that, because it puts the finger on both the idea of cosmopolitan or mu'asira, like sharing, not cosmopolitan, I mean contemporaneity. Like they're sharing an asr, they're sharing a time period. And so yes, like Farroukh, you asked where they trained. So all of the artists trained in Lebanon originally, and then went abroad because they wanted to learn more. They wanted to learn how other people talked about it. They wanted to professionalize. And that was a new thing too, by the way. Like professionalizing was a new opportunity to, associated with like institutions for nation states and hierarchies of who can do what in that as citizens. So they wanted to professionalize. Farroukh goes to a schooling in Rome. Unsi and Choucair also go to Paris. But back to Farroukh. In Rome, he met Egyptians, he met Japanese, he met other people from around the world in those ateliers. They were cosmopolitan spaces. And so for him, that was a normal thing. The problem for him, and probably for most of the people in those ateliers, was that when they were go back home, which is a place that they're creating, because it wasn't the place that they'd left, right? It was in transition and all that. They didn't feel that their local audiences understood or were able to speak the way that atelier group had, which is a normal thing for any artist, as far as I can tell. But it became a national project, and it became something like, here we need to get people here in Lebanon. It's not like, oh, yay, we're in Beirut. His writings didn't say that. He did talk about how beautiful Lebanon was as a natural space and as a source of natural resources, divinely given resources for him. But it was like, damn, this place could be so much if politicians just bought art instead of cars. That was in 1924. Here we are 100 years later, right? So there was that. So your question points to both that sense of contemporaneity and that sense of modernity and having to make it happen. And that also the sense that there's no art here. There's a complete lack and we need to fill it in. We need to get people going with this. And in that sense, I think most of the spaces felt more like a struggle than an opportunity.
I want to talk about that sentence, there's no art here, because you mentioned that in the lecture that I saw. And you'd said, this was a myth, that this was a statement you had heard in the 90s, and sort of it's been a persistent thing that you'd kept on hearing while you've been here. So let me ask it as simple as possible. That sentence, there is no art in Lebanon, has that ever been true?
No.
But they thought it. They thought it then. Okay. So
right. And it's
why
never
did they
been
think
true.
that?
Yeah. No, I mean, as far as I've been able to go back, there have been practices and things that people could call art, fan, rasam, paintings, tabloyet, lawhat, and sculpture and aesthetic practices, the kind of stuff that art historians or anthropologists can get excited about. And that local people revered in a special way as not. I'm not giving you a simple answer, am I?
No, I want the simple questions have complicated answers usually.
Right. So you can go back if you want to. You will find it. There's plenty of traces of it. Yeah. I was limited in how far I went back because I don't know Ottoman. I'm not trained in that history. I'm not equipped. I'm really my own the product of my own training, which at Columbia University was very much a Eurocentric, universalist training around modernity, modern art.
Mm-hmm.
Everything leads up to modernity, and then you get contemporary art after that. So you can slot that in. You can find the things to put on the shelf and say Lebanon had those before there was a Lebanon. You can find it in the region. There was a lot of support for such things. But when I say a lot, it's like I'm looking for that. And if people weren't looking, they could easily say there was nothing here. I don't think, however, that that's a descriptive term, a descriptive sentence. I hear that sentence, or I came to hear it as a challenge, as a kind of prescription, like there should be art here. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And as conveying an urgency, a concern, seeing where you're standing in relation to that concern. And the sad thing for me when I hear the sentence is that it seems to leave the idea of what the art should be very fixed. It seems to suggest that we should have a national museum just like the Tate Gallery in London. And we should have, exhibitions just like you go to in New York. And so like that no art, I hear it as a space for leaving assumptions to be imported or to be compared to other places.
Yeah.
And it was being used in that way in the, I go back reading the newspapers, and Farroukh would tell Karam Karam, hey, dude, you've got a magazine, right? You've got a newspaper you're running. Come look at my studio. And Karam says to him, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm sorry, maybe you can't put that in the podcast.
That's fine.
What are you talking about? There's no art here. And Farroukh says, oh, but come and do a jawli of Lebanon. You take a tour of Lebanon in my studio. And Karam narrates this experience of going into this space that's full of art. And then even as he walks out, he says, gosh, it's so sad that people here don't appreciate art.
Yeah.
So yeah.
The idea of Lebanon specifically, come take a tour of Lebanon. How much of that is sort of tied into the growing nationalism and search for a national identity? And were these artists' work sort of co-opted by that movement in very intentional ways? Or were they just sort of swept up in it?
Yeah, this is interesting, and maybe it's something I need to explore a little more. My research also was very Lebanon-centric. It started out by taking Lebanon for granted, like saying, oh yeah, there's a Lebanon now. And everyone's like, I'm in the confines of Lebanon. I'm not going to go to Syria. I had to leave Palestine, can't go there anymore. So I'm going to look at Lebanese art. And this work, like what you're showing here, is definitely not co-opted in the sense that it was taken against the artist's volition. He was Farroukh, who made this picture showing a woman, I guess, sewing the Lebanese flag and showing a little girl involved in admiring that. Is this Farroukh actually? Okay. He's creating again what could be put into our household, and could create a family that is the cellular block or the atom of a nation. There are not lots of kids there. There's one woman. She's got her arms exposed. She's a modern woman, and they're all dedicated to that project. The flag is unfinished. He definitely worked that way, as did the other artists that I write about, and people were working that way. But they also were committed to a wider region. They believed in Arab, in an Arab content to these nation states. I don't think he was. These artists that I focus on were particularly like the Phoenicianist Lebanese, kind of isolated, or were a special people here that you don't find in neighboring Syria, which, in fact, Farroukh and Unsi were both Muslim scouts who would walk, step by step as groups from Beirut to Damascus, from Beirut to Jaffa.
Yeah.
And they were part of movements like a nudist movement, maybe, that was cross the boundaries that we know of today. Seeing them then only as part of Lebanon is a co-optation that I don't think they blinkered. They didn't blinker themselves that way. They did catalog and inventory. So here's a woman painted by Farroukh who could be seen as a particular type of woman. And they were appreciated that way in the press, oh, you can go and see Lebanon, which is how Karam tells people, you're not going to be able to tour Lebanon, but you can go see it in that atelier. But there were other pictures too of Egyptian nationalist figures who were considered leaders of Arab thought, and also of Beethoven, and Arab philosophers too, going back to Ibn Arabi. There's not a picture of that one, but if I were to pull up the catalog, there would be names to these kind of figures who were picked out to represent a broad Arab imaginary and potentiality. And I don't think they saw themselves as cut off from other places. I mean, doing art in this way, is deliberately modern. I'm not saying that I don't want to be misunderstood as saying that if you looked back in time, you would find paintings exactly like this always. This is a style that deliberately indexes a kind of portrait tradition that Farroukh perfected when he was in Rome and then in Paris. And it uses pigments that are imported. He's not saying this is pure Lebanese. Or pure Arab, let me put it that way. He's saying this is our modern national life that has these characters that we can relate to through these borrowed and locally made, or I call them locally made imports.
Yeah.
And so there's more than just seeing the content. There's learning whole sets of life around that, like that you would look at a painting that is not that person, maybe not even someone you know, and you would have that in your house to think about your space among people who populate this nation, but in a nation that is quite aware of and connected to new technologies and shared practices around the world.
I want to talk a little bit about Saloua Raouda Choucair. She's, I think, of the three, she's the only one I knew before.
Wow.
Yeah. Or at least name recognition wise.
Yeah.
Who was this person? I mean, you gave us a little snippet of her bio, but who was she, and why do you think she's sort of important more broadly? Maybe you think they're all equally important, but
I'm obsessed with all of them. But Saloua Raouda Choucair, whom I met personally, she's the only one I could interview because she was still alive for much of my research period. She is she's hugely inspirational for me. And yeah, okay. So who is she? She was born in 1916. She studied as a child at she went to school at Ahliya School, the national school. It was called in downtown Beirut. And they had art lessons all the way through high school. And by art lessons, they did mean painting, tracing, drawing. And also they taught students how to make really interesting food, how to decorate. This is how Saloua talked about it when she was older, like decorate the sage tin, make an apron. So as she described it, it was a school mostly for girls and for the best brides of Beirut that were kind of an aesthetic, an awareness of the beauty and the harmony and the proportion that you can learn about from art is infused in one's life in all spaces, in the home and in the public project of making citizens and building this nation. So that was very much her training. And then she went to the American Junior College, which was the women's part associated with the American University of Beirut. And she studied life sciences. So she was always interested, it seems, in math and in biology. And also, she was very interested in philosophy and Arabic as a language. She became a librarian at the American University of Beirut and took courses there on the side in philosophy and in Arabic language. And she seems to have been a very unusual character in her time period because she didn't get married until that was not something she did in the 20s or in her 20s or 30s. She was not unusual in the fact that her father had died when she was young. But her mom's approach to it, Zalfa Raouda's way of handling or embracing that situation was a very feminist. We need to be able to rely on ourselves. And I think that also informed all of Saloua de Choucair's work. She told me in her atelier once, anything that I can't find, I make it myself. I invent it. And she worked with a lot of materials. She seems to have been reading scientific literature like the Watson-Crick report when it came out about DNA. Right as soon as it was available, she read in English, French, and Arabic. And she was.
What kind of family was she from? I feel like it would have been rare for a young woman to pursue this type of career. What kind of family was she from to have sort of
it wasn't a career in the sense that okay. So she was from a family, as I had mentioned before, they had land. Some of the land AUB had bought, some of the land they could rent out. And her mother had been educated at Romana High School, which was definitely not a usual woman's path in the 1890s, 1880. Her dad moved out of the picture very early because of his death when he was in the Ottoman army in 1918. And she had an older brother and an older sister, Anissa, and Anis was the brother. They were both really engaged socially. It was a family that was like doing stuff, reading magazines, going to events. And in that sense, it was maybe unusual, but it was also a thing of the times. It was, there were like religious debates and social debates around where women can go. But these were debates that encompassed all women. In the city, because the city was growing, and like her older sister did wear a veil or a headscarf thing her whole life, but Saloua never did, except for one portrait, which was like a phantasm and became like the Tate Modern's, cover portrait. Yeah. So it's, a lot of different things were being explored. Okay, this work is really cool, I think. Yeah. But I don't know. Yeah. Okay. I'll hold on.
No. It's interesting because I feel like you sort of, maybe it's my misreading, but I feel like you describe her sort of as this like rambunctious character.
Yeah.
Is that what she was like?
So she's been described by her peers as a tomboy, as argumentative, as curious, as, not limited by many conventions. And I don't think she was like wildly eccentric. People tell me that Unsi was more eccentric, was just kind of off in his own isolated world, maybe. But for me, she was, when I met her and she was going into her 80s. Yeah, she'd just been 81 when I met her. She was very welcoming, very friendly, but also like not the sort of person who wants to agree with you in a conversation. She's like that. Like, no, but let's think about this. And then, oh, well, why aren't you taking that into consideration? She has a sort of
contrarian streak.
A little bit. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, life was more interesting for her than just repeating things.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. I want to talk a little bit before we started the call. I told you I wanted to ask you to give us recommendations. So I'm going to ask you now. There's two sets of recommendations I want. And this is very much me asking for a friend. Okay. So the first one is about artists. If there's a list of artists that you think are worth checking out online, doing a little research, who would be on that list?
Okay. Danielle Janadri. Should I tell you about her?
Yeah,
or can I just give the name?
No, tell me about her.
She's a person I met while I was working at AUB, and she's left the Fine Arts and Art History department now. She works on landscapes and on visual like the kind of optical relationships people have with landscapes. So the space is usually not, condensed and made into this gorgeous mind-wandering serpentine, but it's just like, oh, where are we? there's often light distortions. There's often a sense of more space than you can encompass. That's the kind of work of hers that I know. She's into pixelation and dots. And so really thinking about how the eye works. I have a work by Choucair Scheid that I bought as a research project. Like, how does it work to buy something on installment in Beirut? It's from 1997, and Choucair Scheid was important to me because of my introduction myself to this topic through the war on Iraq that America waged in 1991. And he's an Iraqi artist known as one of the founders of Iraq and modern art, and thinking about art from perhaps an Arab Islamic ontology, giving that meaning. And his picture, the surah that I bought, is an amulet, he called. It's just a piece of paper. It's burnt on one side and it spins and it's plastered together on the other side. So it makes me think about what people can do after, America has gone in and declared you not valuable for life, and certainly not a place of art. And what can you put together? Hannah Malala is also an artist that works in that way. A place where there's the description is there's no art here. It becomes the prescription. And then that's an opening. Also, I have a work by Omar Fakhouri. No, Ya Allah, don't say it. Yes, Mbella, that's his name. And it's it's a painting of a fragment of a jug. To me, it makes a lot of puns, but I also really like his way of handling the paint, and it feels very fragile. It's a very recent work. Looking at the trash around Beit Shabab, where he's from. And I was always told by people that Lebanese don't hang nudes in their homes. And I went to an exhibition at Salah Barakat Gallery for Azza Abu Rabia, a young Syrian artist who was making art for self-discovery after times of having to leave her country because of her activism and having been in prison. And she made a nude of herself. And I am Lebanese, so I bought that and hung it in my living room. So it's the first thing people see. And finally, I have a work by Monique Haddad, and I'd love to find out where she went. Because, well, not finally, I'll give you another name too. She was also a woman coming to Beirut as a Syrian and worked at Zico House, did a kind of residency at Zico House in the early 2000s, and did these rich, colorful, collages, but they're actually buildings in the Ras Beirut area with the electricity lines going between them, and they're very flattening. And I love urban scenes, and you don't see a lot of urban scenes. I found that strange myself here. And so I liked the idea. At that time, there was intense anti-Syrianism here in Lebanon. So I liked the idea of this very intimate local scene being a place I would walk from work to home, pass when I walk from work to home, and it done in this very different way. And people would say to me, "Oh my God, that's such a great painting. Who's that by?" And I'd say, "Well, it's by Monique Haddad. She's a Syrian." And so
yeah.
And they might blanch. And then there's Abdullah Murad. I recently found his work. I don't know anything really about him. He was active in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s in Syria. And I would say to people so that's why I'd say there's a lot of art here. Go find out about it.
Yeah.
That would be my approach. But
I want to ask about that, the Syrian story for a second. So insofar as so much of the art that you're talking about in this period, the 20s to 50s, was, as we discussed, was sort of co-opted or used, maybe not co-opted is the wrong word, but sort of used in the national building project and served in some ways as a sort of visual language as what this place was in our own imagination, right? And sort of like gave us a sort of a script as to what our creativity could produce, right? Oh, this is Lebanese art, right? And give these like dotted lines around that. Did the art change over that period to reinforce those stories of Mount Lebanon, and we aren't an urban people, we are these we have this provincial story, and we're a very sort of specific type of person? Did it change? And beyond 1950s, what happened after that?
So yes, in fact, the landscapes were one of the first thing I was interested in studying, because everyone told me, as an anthropologist, you tend to follow people and learn to attune into their interests. And is this a landscape or not? I asked myself that. But so this piece by Omar Unsi that shows, I think, orange harvesting or clementine harvest, Abu Yani Effendi probably, they look like to me, with a house with the blue door, and these trees arching very gracefully in, and holding three people described in Falahi dress, Druze, that you could see even from the Sherwal and all that. So these are the sorts of pictures that people told me to look at, or they had hanging in a bank, or a dental lobby, the lobby for a dentist, right? And in 97, there was a retrospective at the Nicolas Sursil Museum, which was devoted to Unsi's work and featured a lot of these in particular landscapes on the upper floor. So you could walk into that space and see all of them there together. Those landscapes I started to study, and it's interesting. Their time period is mostly 40s to, let's say, 60s, and then they get a reprisal of circulation in the 90s. So as an anthropologist, I was interested in their rebirth, to say, like, they're coming back into vogue. And
post Civil War, like nostalgic of the Lebanon we lost. Right,
exactly. And also apparently secular, apparently, like there's no religious activity here, but you can have that kind of communalist idea of Lebanon, like, oh, here are the Druze people. Then we have another picture that you could read as Sunni.
Rahbani nation.
Yeah. But if you trace them back, they are being made in the 40s and 50s to give a sense of how to relate to Lebanon, and how to have the natural space that hasn't been apparently marked by human activity so much, although agriculture is that, but how to have that in the urban space. So these pictures become these portable or these transportable images of mostly the Lebanese landscape, although Unsi and Farroukh did do other landscapes. I mean, places in Palestine today, or in Syria today, in Turkey, in Alsace, places they went to, Cyprus and all. But so these landscapes were made to kind of fill in the lack of connection to nature in an urban space. So they're kind of a contrapuntal or a syncopated looking experience. They weren't there as what people were seeing if they walked around, but as what people could see and appreciate as, like, not just Lebanon, the secular nation, but as actually a divinely created world that then you don't need a denominational religion to look at.
Yeah.
Okay, but they come around in the 40s because the previously national art nudes got replaced. They replaced nudes and other types of scenes that were the national art of the 30s. Like literally, like
so
the new nudes are landscapes in the 30s. Wait, I don't think I answered your question, though.
No, but we have to go there. Hold on for a second.
Okay.
Because what I was going to say, as you were talking about this, I was going to say, oh, this is basically like posting on Instagram. So this is not the life that I actually lead. This is the life you think I lead. So I will be painting the life you think I lead. You think this is what Lebanon looks like, or what my Lebanon looks like, although I'm sitting in the Souk Beirut, like between electrical wires. So I will paint this, right?
Yeah, I mean, so Lindsay and Farroukh walked and collected, like collaged these scenes together to give a Lebanon that they, as influencers, like this is how you should live, or we want you to be working with these things. And they got a lot of promotion for providing such scenes that could help people make sense of chaotic urban life. Yeah,
they're social media influencers who are like, it's as if they're going up to the mountains on a hike and they're like, here I am in this amazing place. You guys should come up here. Check out this life where all sects meet each other and we are all enjoying the sort of the bounty of the land.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So that's great.
And they did scout. I mean, they did do that walking. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But
there's a previous version of this social media.
Yeah.
So I didn't know. So what you're saying is that in the 1930s, the previous dominant artistic medium were nudes.
Yep. Nudes and portraits of, inspiring figures. But the nudes were really inspiring. Yes, nudes. They got front page coverage. They were the things that people talked about in the newspaper reviews.
Were they controversial at all?
As far as I can tell, they were not. I mean, I've looked for condemnations of them. Maybe all of those papers burned.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, there's a lot of discussion of them, and maybe it's a super aggressive discussion. You could say it's a little overdone. But at the level of newspaper discourse, of intellectual discourse, they do not seem to have been controversial. On the contrary.
And these nudes, where are they right now? Like, where do they exist? They're not in my dentist's office. So
no,
where are they?
Well, so my research method was just to ask people, what should I look at? What if I'm here studying art? What can you show me? What is there? And who has art? And, everyone say, well, we don't have a national museum. You should go to the Surso. They have some art. But, this person has collected. And, oh, my grandmother has some. Or here, my aunt or my uncle, this family buys art. Or, yeah, they don't really have art, but they have this piece they've inherited. And that's how I would find the nudes, is going from home to home and people like having them there. And also by reading in the newspapers and seeing pictures of works that maybe I can't even locate anymore. But
would they be portrait? Would they be similar to like a portrait? So it would be like a family member's nude on the wall?
So the unseen nudes that I came across were part of the family's inheritances, and they were hung in like the daughter's bedrooms. So yeah, it was like, this is what my uncle did, and I'm a 14-year-old, and there's this nude woman sitting on a rock and looking at the water. Which looks a lot like, both like Pigeon Rock or, this kind of weird coastal formations or rocks up in Fallujah. Not Fallujah, sorry, I'm thinking Iraq. I can't remember the name now. Can't remember the name. I hope you edit this part out. Up in Harajal, that area, up in Kasserwan.
Yeah.
And also they look a lot like Gibran's work. So Nunsi actually really was inspired by Gibran, I believe, whose work was known here through his books.
Yeah.
Right? His paintings actually weren't known. The nudes that I saw in homes were mostly, inherited, or, I mean, they also, okay, so I'm thinking about nudes that were displayed at exhibitions, and newspapers covered those. And those, they can be traced now. Many of them can be found now. And they're in private collections. They're, I think, in living rooms or places for people to talk about. Maybe they're in private spots. Some of them, I know who owns them, but I haven't been able to visit them. They shared with me the images, but they're not in Lebanon, just even. I mean, the people aren't in Lebanon, although the nudes are. But a nude, like, I don't think you have it prepared as a slide, but the one I talk about, the two prisoners, a Sajinen, the Farroukh, was not commissioned, but like from the record books, from his accounting books, we know that it was bought by a guy named Georges Sade, and that he paid installments with Ottoman lira. And for Farroukh, and showing that work, it was at AUB in West Hall. It's a small work. It's not the big scale of the nudes of the Renaissance period, which were hung over marital beds to promote fertility, like to help women get ready to orgasm, because it was considered necessary to orgasm to conceive. These are smaller nudes, and the ones that I've seen, made to say to people, how are you going to respond to this gorgeous, like stimulating, aesthetically crafted body, which is also an ayah. It's also like a sign of God. The human body is a sign of God.
Yeah.
Are you going to take this for your personal benefit? Or, like, would you want to go to bed with this woman? Or are you going to learn from her to think about her capacities in society and your capacities as a person who can make this world beautiful and harmonious for us to live in together? Which is how you see the connection then to landscapes. Or, are you going to destroy it? Are you going to ravish her? Are you going to cover her up because you're afraid? And so in that sense, they were stimulating and even provocative. But they were not, in that sense, they were not private either.
So is this the subject of your next book?
No.
Okay.
Not at all.
I hope it's the subject of the book after.
It's the subject of an exhibition, actually, that I'm holding at Columbia University.
Okay.
In the fall, it's opening. And we did do an exhibition. Octavian Ashano is the AUB curator, asked me, based on this research, to do an exhibition with him at AUB in 2016 that was called The Arab Nude, the Artist as Awakener. And we found that the nude was this kind of nationally stimulating genre across the formerly Ottoman but not yet Arab region. So you find nudes like this, and actually much larger scale too, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Syria and Palestine. And now for my expanded version at Columbia, I've been finding them in Kuwait, and with a lot of help of many, many people across the region, really. But it's a genre that always seems to say, we don't have this, we don't do this art. What are you going to do about it? And so it seems to be kind of a self-erasing genre. Every time people talk to me about nudes, they're like, oh, but that doesn't really happen here.
So interesting. Okay, the last question I want to ask you before we wrap up is about your bookshelf. So do share, you have an amazing bookshelf. Yes.
Mostly unread, but yes.
Very, very nice. I asked you before we started to pull some books off the shelf and to make some recommendations. So what books off your bookshelf do you recommend people check out?
Okay, so we were thinking, if someone reads Arabic, I think this is a really great book by Soraya Malhaz. It is her testimonial to her life with Raouda. So
for people who are only listening to the podcast and not seeing the screen, what is the name of the book?
The name of the book is النحات التجريدية سلوى de Choucair في مساراتها الشخصية والفنية نموذجا بامتياز, or the abstract art through Raouda's narrative, personality, and sculpture as an excellent example.
Amazing.
It's by Thuraya Melhas.
Okay, cool.
And that's a nice book about language in Arabic. This is that has been very important to me. Beautiful Agitation.
Yes, with Annika
Lenson. Yeah.
Who was on the podcast. Really good episode.
Yes, Modern Painting and Politics. Yeah.
I think it's on my shelf.
This one, I don't know if you can find it. It's also in Arabic. It's Tariq al-Fan by Moustafa Farroukh. It's his personal guidebook on how to get civilized. So,
okay, I need to find that one.
It's
was he like a Dale Carnegie type character on the side?
I don't know Dale Carnegie.
The Dale Carnegie wrote that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, in the 1920s, and it's still a bestseller.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah,
Okay.
That version for winning co-countrymen, compatriots, fellow citizens, and making everything beautiful together. I absolutely love this book by Mira Mittermeier, Dreams That Matter.
Yeah, cool.
This is an anthropology book. The subtitle is Egyptian Landscapes of the Imagination. And this is where I learned to take the... It helped me think about the imaginary that isn't unreal. To take it seriously, to think that this could be actually part of not just art, but the way people are living. There's a really old book by Laila Abouloghid that gets underread nowadays. It was popular in the 80s. And I don't think Laila Abouloghid really is as proud of it as she could be. It's called Veiled Sentiments, as in honor and poetry in a Bedouin society. And there, it's the life of, as she says, the Awlad Ali, a Bedouin group in Egypt who recite poetry and use it in ways to shift their relationships to each other. In terms of thinking about what art is, The Invention of Art is a great book by Larry Scheiner. It's very accessible book that looks at the ideas that we have about art today and how they distilled and were matters of controversy. And so there's nothing natural about art. Elizabeth Thompson has an excellent book on Lebanon, colonial citizens, Republican rights, paternal privilege, gender and French scene in Lebanon. My friend Yasmin Shabi Tahan just had this. Reading Maria Khazen's photographs, Gender Photography in Mandate, Lebanon. Do I get to say any more? Or are we done with that?
You can do the last one. Is the last one you have in your hand?
The last one I have in my hands is Vita, Life in a Social Zone of Abandonment, which is, again, for me, was inspiring, and I teach it to the students in anthropology or thinking about ethnography. It's a story of one woman who's the author, João Biel meets in a insane asylum in Brazil, and he spins out from there to the pharmaceutical industry, the treatment of the economization of life, the terrible ways that families have to relate to each other. But he does this from her imagination of who she could be and her naming herself different names and creating her own dictionaries. So for me, again, it's that phantasm.
Very cool.
I might have mentioned Hannah Feldman.
Yeah.
Her book on From a Nation Torn too. Okay.
Also, former podcast episode, which was really fun too. Kirsten, this was so much fun to talk to you. I learned an enormous amount. I feel like at some point we need to do a follow-up episode.
Would love to.
This was a lot of fun. If anyone's interested in connecting with you, you're easy to find online. The name is Kirsten Scheid. So that's KirstenScheid. Did I get that right? Yes. Kirsten, thanks so much.
Oh, we're done? Okay. Thank you, Mikey. I learned a lot too, actually. You really got me thinking. I think it's great conversing with you.
Thanks so much.
And I really appreciate the opportunity.